Hi. Okay. OC is recording this room. All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Hi, am I audible to everyone?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. First, briefly, 5 points on framing before 3 points of substantive matter. First, your marginal utility of actually chasing after an 8th championship isn't that high for a couple of reasons. First, you've already won 7. Secondly, because of these 7 championships you've already won, you likely already have a lot of fame and money to go with it. And third, there's no indication why 8 championships is a specific bright line that you need to reach. There's no indication that this is setting some kind of record or why 8 is really that much more important than 7. Secondly, the marginal utility of competing in Qatar isn't necessarily that high. There's Grand Prix in places like England where they don't criminalize homosexuality, and you can fully compete there without being afraid of like betraying your values. So there's no necessary reason why competing in Qatar in these countries that actively criminalize homosexuality is necessarily important to you. Thirdly, queer rights probably mean a lot to you for a couple of reasons. First, it's criminalized by quite a number of countries that actually have F1 racing. So the fact that you're taking a stance against like the criminalization of homosexuality means that it likely means a lot to you. And secondly, there's a lot of non-problematic platforms you could have as an influencer. You could be supporting something like hunger education. The fact that you specifically have pointed out that you care about LGBTQ plus rights indicates that this is something that's very personal to you. You likely have a personal experience or know someone that's had a personal issue with discrimination relating to this, which means that this is probably something that means a lot to you as an issue. Fourth, you're more likely to regret betraying values than you are to forego some marginal fame or money. Why? Because the former is binary. You either betrayed your values or you didn't betray your values, but the latter isn't binary. There's no bright line for how much fame or money will really make you happy, and there's no indication why an 8th is really that much better than 7th. Finally, we think that this situation is specifically key because the case before was that there was racing in countries where policy like criminalized homosexuality. F1 racers were never really being criminalized. There was never really a major disqualification of a racer in your time while you were competing because you've never been in a situation where you've had to think about backing out of a race because there was an act of harm committed to another F1 racer. There's 2 implications here. First, this means that there's an active harm being applied to another person, and then it actually demands you to reevaluate your stance on this because there's really nothing you can do about legislation, but there's a lot you can do about F1 racing and the community in F1 racing. And secondly, there's some level of solidarity and unity that you have with another racer. Our first argument is about why this is principally just. First, you have a huge platform. You have a lot of fans and people watching you. They've first invested a lot of time, money, and energy looking out for you. And F1 fans by nature are quite fanatical. So they're likely going to get really upset if they can't watch you, especially given your past accolades and fame. Secondly, this is a particularly polarizing issue, which means that your fans likely agree with your platform. 2 implications here. First, they definitely support you, and at least a great amount of them to some extent will boycott this event with you as long as well as other events that you decide to like not compete in. Secondly, independently of you backing out, it's likely that you may actually lose a number of your fan base by not doing anything about it. I think we see this a lot with Taylor Swift and her views on Israel-Palestine. A lot of people are actively criticizing her for not having a public stance on this because a lot of people align with a lot of her values on other issues. And this is likely going to be true of your fan base because you're particularly vocal about LGBTQ rights, and they likely agree with you. Secondly, you have sponsors that support you. Again, they fund you knowing about your platform and knowing where you stand on this issue. So what means when you pull back, that means you're taking a lot of these all these sponsorships and all this money and like attention away from the actual competition itself. This means that the Qatar Grand Prix is going to lose a lot of credibility and money by having you drop out of the race. And what this means is that the implication is that you're going to create an incentive for Qatar and other countries that are organizing these races that their F1 like organizational teams aren't going to disqualify other career drivers in the future. We'll bite the bullet and say that legislative change is unlikely at a national level, but you can certainly change how F1 operates and how other career drivers are treated. We're not trying to make the argument that like Qatar is going to fundamentally change their attitude toward homosexuality, but at least on a bare minimum level, you're able to create an incentive for other countries to not actively disqualify other drivers and kind of differentiate themselves from the policy of their country and the policy that they're using to treat their drivers. Our second piece of positive matter is the idea that you're likely going to get disqualified anyway. There's a couple of reasons this could happen. First, you could just get pressed on your views on LGBTQ views by the same media that outed this other driver, and you're obviously not going to lie given that you've already been very vocal about LGBTQ, like your support for the LGBTQ community, which is that when you're pressed on your views and you're being very vocal about it, especially when you're vocal about it in relationship to the upcoming Grand Prix, there's a big likelihood that they're going to force you to drop out too, given the fact that you're probably getting a lot of media attention. Secondly, Qatar has specifically taken an unprecedented step to disqualify this other racer. If other countries that have had like policies regarding homosexuality haven't taken this active step to actually disqualify racers, Qatar has, which means that it's likely they're going to do the same for you. There's no reason you get any protection just because you're not outed as queer. The fact that you're vocal about queer rights means that there's the likelihood that you're going to get disqualified anyways. And if not now, at the very least, it's likely that this is going to happen in the future and you're going to get disqualified in the future. Why is this relevant? It's much better for you personally to actively decide against competing in this competition than to be forced out of it. There's two reasons why. First is credibility. You're going to lose a lot of credibility as an influencer in the F1 racing community if you aren't actively doing something about a platform that you supposedly care so much about. Secondly, the principle obviously outweighs the pragmatics. We've already given you justifications in the framing for why this is the case, but we've already indicated that it's a binary of either you stick with your values or you don't, whereas like the amount of fame or like money that you get isn't necessarily strictly a binary, which means that you're going to forever live with the guilt of knowing that you didn't stick by your values. And obviously it's something that's likely very personal to you, whereas you're not going to live with the guilt of not getting that 8th championship because you're likely able to sustain a life on your own, given the amount of fame and money that you've already received. Our final argument is on cognitive dissonance. We think that by not actively doing, given the context of the situation in which Qatar has actively disqualified this other driver, someone that belongs to your community, that has a very similar career to you, you're going to feel a lot of guilt by not doing anything about it. There's a couple implications of the guilt that you're going to feel upon being very passive about the situation that's very polarizing and very imminent in your life. First, this could affect performance and you might have a quicker burnout. If you don't do anything about the Qatar Grand Prix, maybe like by not doing anything about it, that basically emboldens other countries to do the same thing, where they're going to actively treat other queer drivers really poorly. And as you're living with this, you're going to feel really bad about it. You're going to have burnout. You're not going to love the sport as much because you're going to feel that it's a really unsafe community for people that are queer identifying. Second is your family and friends, who likely also have some kind of personal connection or affiliation or some reason why they support the LGBTQ rights as well. We've already indicated that you're taking a big risk by publicly supporting this. You don't have to publicly support it. There are other non-polarizing things you could be supporting. And the fact that you support it in the first place means that you likely have a personal connection. This could come from the queer experience of a family member or a friend. You're likely then going to get backlash from these people that have publicly supported you, people that actively care about you. We think this is going to outweigh backlash you get from Qatar or another country, or even the F1 community, like at worst case possible, because these are figures that actually love and care about you, and they're likely the inspiration for why you care so deeply about this issue in the first place. We think backlash from these kinds of people is going to lead to cognitive dissonance that outweighs any kind of cognitive dissonance that you can get by dropping out of the race and dropping out of subsequent races that where queer F1 racers are penalized for being queer.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. With that, I would like to invite the leader of opposition for their speech here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah. Give me a second. Starting speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The argument that opening government lays out relies on two things that are just completely unrealistic. One, that this particular racer has Taylor Swift levels of like fandom, and two, that he probably has like a gay son or something, to the extent that it is so personal to those that this particular issue is so personal to him that they will feel sweat and guilt by not like boycotting this particular issue. Right? I'm gonna disprove those particular issues and by just proving a few things. firstly, why this particular issue probably does not necessarily matter to this F1 driver as much as like opening government tries to argue about. Secondly, how this particular F1 driver is probably going to be quite replaceable in the F1 circuit, to the extent that the moment that you start quitting, that you sort of quit and like sort of not engage in a lot of the important Grand Prix, you suddenly lose a lot of the influences, lose a lot of the influence and platforms and ability for you to actually like influence other people's decision making and other things like that. Thirdly, as well, I'm going to prove to you why this is not a good form of advocacy for like the LGBTQ rights, especially again for these new and how this actively harms, in fact, the younger and newer driver that is getting disqualified, right? Firstly, I just want to point out this, take out this one like analysis from like OG that says like, you're gonna get disqualified anyway for your views, right? No, this is not gonna happen because one, you're not actually gay yourself. The reason that this particular person got disqualified is because that person himself cannot be like in this country without being criminalized. But also secondly, this particular person probably is like, because like got disqualified, it's more comfortable to disqualify them because like younger and newer driver, and those therefore hasn't built up the reputation yet. You have, but also secondly, there's a massive difference between quitting and quitting on your own and like getting kicked out, right? There's a lot more outrage and backlash if you get kicked out, right, by your fans, because like it seems like corruption and other things like that, comparatively to like you quitting, which is like your own decision. It's just like, yeah, whatever, he wants to do that. It's not us that is being corrupt and other things like that. So I don't think they're probably just gonna be able to as easily say like you're just gonna get kicked out for your beliefs, right? Okay, so going on to like framing, right? Firstly, why is this probably not something that you actually like care that much about, right? Firstly, a lot of athletes like actually also advocate for like LGBTQ plus rights, and then only to turn around and like play for in like Saudi Arabia, or for instance, like you look at how many like player in like football that like wears the rainbow armband only to turn around and like play in Saudi Arabia, where they still behead like gay people and other things like that. Secondly, there's a lot of just commercial interest in like actually like being a public advocate for like LGBTQ plus rights, especially if you come from like a lot of Western liberal democracies, whereby it is quite popular to be an advocate for these things, right? Which means that there's to the extent that the info slide only says that you're publicly advocating for these rights, does not mean that you have fiat to then say that like this is something that is near and dear to your heart. No, there's a lot of corporate reasons and commercial selfish interest for you to publicly advocate for them. You're just getting more fans in your particular home countries and other things like that, to the extent that this is just can be motivated by your own personal interest, right? And it's not necessarily at the tipping point to do that. But also, secondly, again, the motion side says as well that you have driven in these particular countries that criminalizes gay people before. You know for a fact that that they like already like commit torture and behead like a lot of gay people within these particular countries. You know already that they criminalize them in these particular countries, and yet you still feel comfortable enough to race in them. You know, why? I don't see like outside of them saying like it's also your fellow F1 driver, that again the motion slide doesn't clearly state that this is like your clear friend or things like that. That why this should necessarily be the tipping point. Why is an F1 driver suddenly more important than like regular gay people within these particular countries that are already facing persecution and other things like that, right? They have to prove why there's a tipping point. They can't just say it's because your colleague is doing it right now, right? So now, okay, so what is the cost of not participating, right? Note that in a lot of these countries, competitions and like sport that requires you to like actually like do a lot of competitions to maintain relevancy. It's very easy for you to like slip out of like relevancy. Like just even look at debate, right? If you quit for like 2 years, it's very easy for everyone in the circuit to suddenly already forget about you, unless you like Bosio or something. But even then, even right now, Bosio's influence is very much not as big as like a lot of other debaters in the current circuit right now, because like you simply have not been present in that particular circuit. You haven't competed, you haven't shown yourself that you're still the champion and other things like that. And other champions, there's always a lot of other drivers that can always replace you and sort of like get a step on that podium and bring their fans along with them and other things like that. With what this means is if you stop going to these particular Grand Prix, and note that a lot of these Grand Prix are in like countries that actually also criminalize gay like LGBTQ plus people, because like it's like countries like Qatar, countries like Malaysia, countries like a lot of these particular countries, because they're the ones with like oil money that sort of like support a lot of and like have the funds to like sort of like fund a lot of these F1 races, because note that F1 races cost a lot of money, and a lot of the Western liberal countries don't necessarily want to spend that much money for these Grand Prix. It's like a lot of these more homophobic countries that do, note that then you'll be like basically exiled and not be able to compete in this particular other like races as well, and you just lose your relevancy and ability to to show to the entire world that you're still the world champion and maintain your fans and other things like that. This also means that your fans hate you as well, because they say themselves that your fans hate you for, like, for instance, not being able to compete, not racing in the particular races. But note that a lot of them will also like very much have some of them, like the people that you're trying to have their minds changed to begin with, also have a lot of these homophobic tendencies and homophobic beliefs as well, right? To that extent, then I don't see a reason why their fanaticism for you suddenly supersedes their homophobic beliefs to begin with. I.e., in that regard, right? They won't hate the F1 races for like actually like and like boycott the F1 races for like disqualifying the gay rights and causing you to boycott. They'll hate you for boycotting and not racing, and like seeing that believing that your particular crusade for this is quite unjustified and making you nuts, for instance, which means you'll probably lose a lot more fans as well. Why is the counterfactual better? I think like the counterfactual is better because for advocacy as well, because you just stay in the circuit more, you are able to influence them more. Your fans don't leave you because you lose relevancy and they start hating you for being too fanatical in your LGBTQ plus, right? Therefore, you still have that platform to advocate to publicly advocate and continue your advocacy, compared to like absolutely losing your platform and also losing a lot of the commercial and corporate interest benefits that staying at the top brings you, right? Because you, again, as mentioned, you lose a lot of these things. You lose a lot of them the moment you start you lose a lot of the ability to influence. You lose a lot of the achievements that you could have possibly achieved. You lose that a particular fame as well very quickly in a moment in a sport where there's a lot of people to replace you, and those particular reasons proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the leader of opposition for that fine speech. With that, I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech here.
Just a second. Let me turn on my watch. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. A few clarifications before I begin, right? We're not claiming Taylor Swift levels of fame, but that they face similar backlash regardless. The point we are trying to make is that fans have values and get mad when you don't abide by those values. And let's say, even if there isn't a Taylor Swift level of devotion, right? Like where she's seen as like a god level figure, that actually works in our favor, because a figure like that is harder to like take down when they make a mistake, right? But if someone doesn't have Taylor Swift level of devotion, as you might say, they're more likely to lose a lot of followers very fast regardless. So they have to make sure that their advocacy is in the right place and they actually stand by the values that their fans abide by so that they can keep them, right? Number 2, you obviously won't support this LGBTQ rights topic as much as they do because they're a big advocate, as said in the slide, if they didn't care about this that much, because they already know this is a very controversial topic in the world. So once you actually support it, it's something you care about and it's a big part of your platform, right? Now moving on to some things they've said and what our responses are, right? Firstly, you said that the fact that you've driven in these countries doesn't makes it very clear that you don't care about this issue that much, right? And perhaps that how is this time any different, and how are these rights any different to the rights of people living in the country in the first place? We tell you that this time is different because the game has actively stopped a participant from participating, and we tell you this is different because now F1 itself has disqualified a participant, right? And you actually have some say over the rules of F1 versus the rules of the country. It is very hard to actually cause policy changes in countries like Qatar, like my first speaker already said, but when you have such a big influence in F1, you're much more likely to have an influence on changing their laws. And because you are such an influential driver, you've won 7 WTCs, it's clear that obviously you will have some say on the rules that F1 follows, right? Moving on, they claim that other drivers can replace you. I don't think that's actually likely to be true because they've won 7 world driving championships, and that's a big feat, right? And there will be a void when this driver is missing, which makes it very clear that people will feel that something is missing in the game and other drivers won't be able to replace it. Perhaps maybe in the future, even if we're charitable, that could happen. But at the beginning, That will not happen. And on our side, the House is actually more likely that people will feel the void and people will realize it, because this will create a lot of public image like things, right? People will start like it's gonna get traction in the media, and that will make it very clear that, oh, this player isn't there because they're standing up for a right. So it's not just like they disappeared out of nowhere. This will get a lot of media attention. Number 3, they somehow claim that your fans will start hating you just because you don't compete. That does not make much sense, because they haven't given us any reason to understand why fans care more about one game versus a whole issue. We tell you people care more about their personal issues and issues that affect them, their values, the rights they stand up for, the actions they care about, more than just one game, right? Or even like a few games, because people care about what's more personal to them. They won't, why exactly would they think that this action is too frank? They care about the values of the driver much more than they care about like a few games, because a game is just a game in the end. It's nothing personal to them, whereas a value could be a lot more personal and could hurt them a lot more. Moving on to our argument, another additional like analysis on this issue, right? We tell you that you lose out your credibility as an advocate. I'll take you in a second. And as an advocate, when essentially you like don't get out of this game. I'll take you really quickly.
Look, the problem here is you're painting this as a binary when clearly you have options that you can do. Whether it looks like putting a pride flag on your car, maybe talking about in your post-game interviews, it's not a binary. You can still advocate. You don't have to leave the race.
Okay, there's a difference between that as well, because we don't know the laws in the countries exactly. Putting a pride flag on your car could also get you in trouble, right? At least this way, you're protecting your career in a way and also giving a very, very strong message, right? What would happen if you put a pride flag on your car is that you might as well like lose a lot of support because of like local population, whereas on this side, they realize that you essentially like stop coming to the game because you disagree with it, right? In terms of losing all your credibility, as an F1 driver known for supporting and advocating for LGBTQ rights, your reputation is built on supporting these rights, and that it's an important part of your brand. Your fan base is tied to these values and actions, and will like every action that you have will be scrutinized through this lens, right? For example, you can literally stop liking celebrities just because they don't advocate for an issue. For example, I perhaps could have liked Taylor Swift, but because she said nothing about Palestine, I will stop liking her. Right? So this suggests that you are willing to set aside your principles for the sake of competition if you don't advocate for these rights. And you will be seen as a hypocrite and inconsistent with your advocacy. What are the mechanisms for this, right? When you boycott, you make a very definitive statement that you will not under any circumstance, face or support an event that actively stops queer participants from taking part. This reinforces your commitment to LGBTQ rights and makes it clear that you're willing to sacrifice personal success and financial gain to uphold these values. This will strengthen your integrity, and like it's an action of public rejection of Qatar's stance on this issue, right? It clearly like signals fans and fellow drivers, because you're so influential, to also do so, and actually it gets a lot of media attention, so people who aren't even your fans and don't follow you closely are more likely to read about this as well, right? On a personal level, it's very important because you are also likely to gain more followers, because like we said, people who are your fans are already your fans, knowing that you support this because it's a big part of your platform, as the info slide says. But people who don't care about you as much before might start caring about you more. For example, this looks like Macklemore gaining a lot more followers after he released the song Hands Hall after the situation in Palestine. That clearly shows you people care about personal issues and likely to start following people just based on their platform and not even just because of what they do, right? Number 2, you leave a long-term legacy as a driver who has used their platform for fight for what is right. You will be remembered a lot longer than you would be just for winning 7 WDCs, right? Because this is an issue that cares about rights, and human rights activists, especially queer rights activists, will gain a lot of like not even just fame, recognition, but like it's a personal thing for him as well. So what have we shown you today, right? We've clearly shown you firstly that you have the marginal utility of winning one more game or perhaps a few more games is not that much higher. Number 2, you have a moral obligation to help system and change the F1 system and move towards change. 3rd, you will feel a lot of cognitive dissonance. 4th, you will lose your credibility as an advocate if you don't do this, right? And we've clearly shown you every argument they've given us, firstly about, oh, you're not that famous. Doesn't make sense in this debate, and your fans will hate you. That does not make sense because people care about personal issues a lot more. With all these points, we strongly believe that the motion's in our favor. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. With that, I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition for their speech. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Perfect. I'll take POIs to chat. Probably at 5. Panel, if Boseo wants to introduce a new motion type today as an active debater, I'm pretty sure that he can do that because he has the weight and the power to make a post within, I don't know, debate series posting platforms to say that, I think that this house, I don't know, something is good for the debate circuit and people actually follows and discuss it. But if it's someone, for instance, have dropped out for, I don't know, 20 years and comes out and say, I want to introduce a new motion that says TH something else, I'm pretty sure that no one gives a fuck insofar as to that degree, people already think that he's outdated and therefore has no more connections or higher up powers to say that he has enough legitimacy to claim all of these actions that he want to make. In the end of the day, I think that opening off versus opening gov exchange is a question on degree of change versus likelihood of change. On gov side, you want big changes, revolutionary to that degree, but on a low likelihood scale versus on opening opposition where you get smaller scale changes, concessions, little concessions, in fact, but more likely on our side. I think the question is which one is worth the trade-off. Panel, the debate can only won by government bench if the tipping point analysis makes it far better for you to boycott the Qatar Grand Prix. The frame that Andrius gave you is simple. The point in which you quit the Qatar Grand Prix is the point in which you cash out on your weight and power in the circuit and make a public statement against the commission. No, you are not dropping out or retiring from the competition per se, but you are boycotting it. This means that the more likely situation on gov is a tough, harsh stance against the race itself and the stance taken behind the race towards the commission. The analysis that follows is that you also, at the point in which you boycott, become external to the structure of F1 racing. The reason for this is simple. If the WDC and F1 organization is willing to disqualify an individual for being gay, by logical extension, they probably have a low tolerance stance towards these drivers to start with. This means that by intuition, even if you boycott the race, there is not much that the F1 association would do, but more likely you piss them off and you make sure that you lose every friend within the association that you have right now. This is the entire Andrius' case. A couple of reasons why, as Andrius mentioned, this will happen. One, these host countries have laws and religions that are deeply indoctrinated and stagnant to change. Two, sponsors run on profit incentive and won't support drivers that willingly place themselves in danger for not driving, because the point in which you cannot drive anymore is the point in which you also cannot make money by winning races for the sponsor. Three, the F1 Association probably still have a large base of fans who want to watch racing anyways. This means that to a large extent, I think that insofar as there's a lot of infrastructure already placed there, it's unlikely that these structures will change. The second subframe that Andrius runs from here is that your fame dies out quickly in the world of sports. Note here, this analysis is particularly a nuanced one. The point in which you boycott a certain event is the point in which you piss people off. This looks like, I don't know, if Boseo dropped out for a year in the debate circuit, he likely loses persuasiveness and weight over issues in the circuit that cares about. The reason for this is twofold. One, you no longer have contact people in higher up that are willing to listen to you. Two, you probably lose a lot of the credentials or persuasive power within the circuit to be as powerful as you once were. I think this looks like, even though Michael Jordan sometimes will show up to discussion in the circuit, he no longer creates a much more heated issue or meaningful discourse on issues that he cares about right now. Extensions from opening opposition here. One, why is the counterfactual on a world where you can do far more for the circuit for LGBTQ drivers or even minority drivers in general, even for the young driver in the case? Note here, I think we call into OG's principal claim that yes, these issues are often one of values and often one that cannot be considered against. I think this means the comparative OO defense here is not one where you end up calling out LGBTQ issues and being a homophobe contrary to identity. The first claim that we make here is that being in a circuit and not showing animosity is where you can push for more likely changes for the benefit of other fellow drivers that are suffering the same thing in the circuit for a safer environment. No, this claim is one that is traded off against boycotting the race holistically. The reason for this, and the fact that it's not symmetrical, is that it's often the point in which you choose to boycott a race is where you build animosity against the F1 Association. Two, by logical extension, if you boycott this race, you also probably have to boycott other similar hosts like Malaysia. I think at this point, you also trade off and become external player to the circuit. You probably can race to a limited extent, but by then, you would not have been able to make enough competitive edges to compete on a high level. The reason being that you literally lose on many other similar races to accumulate points to become the champion. What is weighing here? I think that on both sides, you as a driver advocating for LGBTQ rights is also probably cognitively aware that you're doing something great for the drivers and for the circuit. I think to this extent, OG's argument is that you get cognitive dissonance and feeling terrible for betraying yourself is already taken out because there's a wash on both sides and it's symmetrical. The observation I want to make here is that the fans' reaction on opening is at best a wash out on opening government. I.e., on Gov, they hate you for not abiding by your values, and you also have fans on a conservative spectrum that watches you make open comments. How does O break the deadlock here? I think that the info side broke it implicitly. If you logically have been able to advocate for LGBTQ rights for the past 7 championships without causing big troubles, it logically also follows that it's likely a world where OO continuing to advocate for these relevant rights will not trigger anyone else. The first fundamental question here is whether the WDC Commission is likely to respond to the things that you push for change on opening government. This is a claim that is contingent on many other burdens being fulfilled. On the outset, I think that by you and yourself alone, it's incredibly hard for you as an advocate for the entire circuit, for the reason being that you're often numerically outnumbered by many others within the same community. 2, you are also taking out on the biggest association and players within your circuit to voice your concerns, and so it's much harder for you to make demands on OG's world. The intuition here is, if every driver within your current circuit is one that is of an open liberal one, I'm unsure why is it that it cannot be done on our side as well when you only make relevant advocacies. This means that within the current circuit, there's a lot of fragmentation and conflicts as well. No, thank you. OG's subsequent push is that, you have others to join in on the movement and that becoming part of the driving force for success. I think this is the point where the analysis for OG is iffy. Insofar as other drivers may not logically advocate for the same rights you do, and others also have their own career to chase and championships to win, I think the calculus and the biggest delta that OG needs to prove is why other drivers will join in as well. I think that to the extent that this is just an active motion and other actors also have other bigger incentives without being advocate for LGBTQ rights, I think it's a far higher tipping point for government to have the critical mass for that degree of change. Why to create one that you also have to balance? First, I want to clarify against OG's claim that the 8th championship does not mean jack shit to you. The info slide already pointed out that you as a driver are chasing for the 8th championship. I think by this standard, you probably care about races in general. But further to that, I want to flip the frame from OG and say that your career is important to you and for the round because it's also the working capital for your persuasiveness within the current circuit as an internal actor. I think it's far worse on government side to the point in which you are foregoing your career by catching on what you have right now and relying on OG's speculative banking for revolutionary changes. I think this is a point where you do far more opening opposition. For instance, arguing for the review of the adjudication over disqualification of the young driver to begin with, or for instance, getting smaller concessions such as better rights and treatments for people in general, or for instance, catering to more audiences as well, or even, for instance, appealing to the chair of the commission right now because you're close friends with him since you are a 7-time champion right now, means that every analysis from opening government also applies to us. The difference being that the changes that we ask for is a lot more achievable and also a lot more friendly to drivers in the general circuit. And then this means that in general, we get a lot more buy-in, a lot more friendly policies, we get slower changes, but we eventually get there. I think that based on this and that there's no urgency proven from open government, I'm unsure why is it that it's so important to do it now and that we have to bang on career to make it happen.
I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for the fine speech. With that, we come to the end of the opening half of this debate. Moving on to the closing half, I would like to invite the Member of Government from CG. Here.
Yeah, thanks. I prefer POIs in chat, maybe around 5, preferably from opening. I'll see whether I can take a POI anyways. Okay. Okay. Start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. I want to differentiate from OG real quickly because all they talk about is about more obligation and principles about as you as a driver who has advocated for LGBTQ rights, why you should be compelled to be able to publicly advocate for them in this instance. And while we agree entirely on that, I want to differentiate with them by talking about especially Qatari's current economy or economic situation that can actually lead us to being able to create a cascade of impacts regarding the LGBTQ movement worldwide, or even like supporting internal protests in Qatar regarding LGBTQ protests as a driver who's going to publicly advocate for LGBTQ rights, right? Firstly, I want to talk about Qatar's economy with 3 layers. Firstly, clearly, they also have hosted things like FIFA World Cup, right? But because, remember, during that time, there were a ton of controversies about LGBTQ rights and even human rights in general. And a sizable amount of people at that time had already boycotted the World Cup at that time. Comparatively, maybe that really doesn't matter to Qatar in terms of like money, but I posit it does, because they still lost a relatively meaningful chunk of money at the income at the end of the day. But secondly, I will posit that currently in the status quo, their oil prices are dropping. And this is really bad because Qatar's main source of monetary income that they rely on heavily for their wealth and economy in general is oil at the end of the day. But thirdly, there's a lot of geopolitical conflicts that Qatar is already in with a lot of like countries in particularly Middle East, right? Let's say like with Iran, especially after the assassination of the Hamas leader, which means it forces Qatar to face these issues and deal with the implications of not being able to trade with them, etc., or at least obtaining like having to trade off obtaining certain benefits from these countries, right? What this means, the implication of my characterization about Qatar's economic situation is that Qatar is in a very precarious position at the moment, where people in Qatar are more worried about their nation's economy than ever before. Or at the very least, they know that Qatar is already put in a very difficult position in the status quo on the world stage. I also posit that at this point, people may also start considering whether their state should relax on their like criminalization of LGBTQ rights, especially if as an actor, we actively boycott the Qatar Grand Prix. But remember, they don't have to advocate for like LGBTQ rights. They just have to advocate to like decriminalize LGBTQ in Qatar. Okay, 3 outcomes from this that will like lead to a cascade of impacts from our action of boycotting the Qatar Grand Prix. Firstly, maybe Qatar will make some concessions. I really believe it does. Firstly, how does it look like? Maybe Qatar lets LGBTQ drivers to participate, especially when they've learned from past experiences that have compounded until today when they hosted the World Cup. I'll take you later. And groups of people were already boycotting the World Cup in the past. It doesn't make sense to me as to why they wouldn't start boycotting like this Qatar Grand Prix when you as a 7 world champion are also actively boycotting it. This is more like to happen because in the status quo, F1 drivers are already wearing LGBTQ colors on their helmets and cars, and they don't get disqualified. So even if you don't buy that, I'm still going to link it back to World Cup, the World Cup situation, right? But even then, World Cup fans who did go to the World Cup wore LGBTQ pins and colors. Football players publicly advocated for LGBT movement, for the movement in the field. Protesters attended the World Cup to call out Qatar and were at risk of arrest or even arrested in some cases. It means that Qatar has always been under scrutiny to a very large extent, and this has dramatically been exacerbated after the World Cup, especially, or at the very least, whenever F1 visits Qatar each year, the crucial and worrying discussions about Qatar itself and about the LGBTQ movement gets brought up over and over again to some extent, where people are talking about how Qatar, whether this is like beneficial to Qatar in the first place. But secondly, I think the second outcome then is that we believe that domestic pressures will increase exponentially against Qatar, which has already been built up for some time already, right? Which means that like since World Cup, Qatar has a lot of controversy about the criminalization of LGBTQ rights and even human rights in general, and coupled with worrying economic performances, Qataris, we believe, are becoming more worried about, let's say, how they can sustain businesses, how they can maintain their lifestyle, etc., or even if not Qatari people, then the Qatari government or like more like whatever they have is already worried about these situations and how they can sustain, further sustain it into the long-term future. But the third one, which is what I do impacting, is that it can be a focal point or even platform for LGBTQ movements within Qatar itself, because 3 layers. 1, you come out actively supporting protests within Qatar against LGBTQ criminalization, or you also come out supporting protests of LGBTQ movement against the criminalization of the movement as a whole. You platform these protests and you at least make people to be more aware of these protests at the very least. Before I move on, take OO.
All right, let me be clear. You are saying that these Qatari audiences would betray the doctrines that have been taught for the past 100 years to support one random driver in the current circuit that says, I want change.
No, they don't have to support or like betray their doctrines, for example. They just have to stop criminalizing LGBTQ in the sense, right? And secondly, I don't think it needs necessarily to be like Qatari people, right? Maybe even Qatar government, it would be powerful enough to be able to influence the Qatari citizens as to why we should decriminalize LGBTQ movement at the end of the day. As to why when we decriminalize it, we open ourselves up more to the world stage, but we also open ourselves more up, like more avenues for us to be able to create income or like create a very good like income flow to the country. They're able to sustain until the long-term future, and which means you're able to sustain yourselves on the world stage as well. Secondly, you prompt other teams with liberal values like McLaren and Mercedes to not participate in these events in the most extreme cases as well, or to be more vocal about LGBTQ values and the movement as a whole, because we don't think that having LGBTQ flowers or colors on your helmets and cars is enough in this case. You have to set the standard as a 7-time world champion, and in this case, you do. This has cascading impacts of both teams also have huge fan bases within F1 that are with them through thick and thin and have been with them through thick and thin as well. So it's most likely they'll support it as per like OG's characterization. But thirdly and lastly, you're able to trigger secondary protests against Qatar's the LGBTQ criminalization. You attract more and more and more worldwide attention on Qatar, and in general, LGBTQ criminalization in this case. This is important because you want to showcase that you like LGBTQ is objectively shouldn't be decriminalized, and it isn't wrong for like a person to be gay or to be bisexual. It's how they were born as, and you should just live with it because you can't change them at the end of the day. With that, proud to propose.
I would like to thank the member of government for the fine speech. With that, I would like to invite member of opposition from closing opposition. Here.
Hello, I'll take POIs in chat, please. Two things in the speech that are independently round-winning. First, I'll vertically explain why you have no leverage to create any change from the perspective of both Qatar as well as the team that sponsors you themselves. And secondly, I'll explain why, even if, for example, advocacy is important to you, why alternative forms of advocacy are more effective. So first, on why you have no leverage to create change. And I want to talk about why Qatar is never going to accept this, which also directly responds to the closing government. Firstly, it is fundamentally against the ideology of the state and the law itself, where it is illegal to display things like engage in acts of homosexuality, and you perceive the existence of being homosexual as immoral in and of itself, as like betraying the tenets of Islam, which is important to the nation as a whole. And the World Cup is something that is state sanctioned, but the government itself is not going to let in someone that is potentially going to be a criminal by engaging or displaying homosexuality themselves. But also the monarchy itself believes in Sharia law, and they believe it is immoral to, for example, be queer, which means they're directly sanctioning or allowing someone who is they themselves believe to be against their own ideology in and to receive benefits like fame or money or sponsorships. And notably, this is more important than potential economic benefits, right? But the fact that Qatar is a monarchy means they don't necessarily have to care about short-term things like economic pressure or international pressure, which gives them more freedom to care about ideology because they can do what they wish and they aren't beholden to their citizens, even if citizens were to be harmed by, for example, potential economic harms. But secondly, and this is going to deal with the economic claims as well, you get significantly more local backlash, which is worse for you economically as Qatar. And this is because Qatari viewers themselves also are not going to turn out because they believe this to be endorsing somebody that goes against the religion they themselves believe to be dear to their hearts, or violating it sends you to damns you for internal damnation. And this is quite important, right? Because local fans' backlash is significantly more important than international backlash because there's just more of them. And the structural reason here is quite obvious, right? It's more accessible to do things like travel within your own country or from a neighboring country like Bahrain, but also, hates gay people as well, compared to someone who is across the seas in perhaps a Western country that has significantly harder to, travel from because it's going to be more expensive, to take more time off work to compensate for flights and the times to travel as well. But it suggests there's just quantitatively more local fans in and of themselves, which means it prioritizes them more and their own beliefs. This is why Qatar will never accept this. This is a stronger reason to opening opposition because it's kind of speculative how much leverage you have within, for example, your own F1 team. But if Qatar is never going to accept this, that leverage does not matter, and therefore this is never going to succeed. But secondly, your team is also going to replace you as well, alongside anyone else that is going to join you that OG suggests. And this is for two reasons. Well, just firstly, like if you don't believe as like a team that Qatar will ever change, you don't take this risk, and therefore they have no incentives to keep you on the team because you're not competing. Like even if you're famous and have sponsors, it doesn't matter if you're not going to race. But secondly, and more importantly as well, that like individual drivers are significantly less important to winning races compared to many other sports. And this is because in F1 specifically, success is often more determined by the quality of the equipment and the quality of the car themselves, like how aerodynamic they are, like the balance between acceleration and like the top speed of the car, and the different combinations in which you like build the car, like build different car models. And this is structurally true because oftentimes the equipment you use determines the ceiling of the possible success you can achieve. Where no matter how skilled you are as a driver, it doesn't matter if your engine doesn't go fast enough to win the race. And this is just intuitively true as well, because it's why time differences between F1 racers are larger than in, for example, like F2 or lower level races when you have standardized car models. This just suggests significantly that the individual skill of each specific driver is less important. And the implication of this is twofold. It means one, because individual skill is less important to success, they have more incentives to replace you because they don't care about your particular skill or expertise. But secondly, it also suggests that cults of personality socially within F1 form more around brands and car models themselves as opposed to individuals. For example, sponsors are not attached to you as an individual, which also refutes a lot of the claims you get from opening governments. This is important because it responds to the opening government principle, because they don't fulfill the principle if you can actually create change. You don't solve your emotional, like cognitive dissonance if you feel frustrated and helpless and regret because you can't make any change. But it also just allows like other benefits to outweigh, because if you have no change on either side of the house, at least on our side, we can have the utility of competing in and of itself, which allows it to outweigh. So the second thing to talk about then is why we have alternative forms of advocacy and why this is better. I'll take opening if there's a POI. Okay. So first, I just want to respond to why you're not going to get disqualified. Like one, this is a unique response from OO. It's logistically difficult. Like if you remove a player, like it fucks with the bracketing and the way the race functions as well. And there's like lots of paperwork that would be involved. It's significantly more difficult to replace someone in the middle of a match and in the middle of a competition. But secondly, even if there were fears about you being replaced for doing advocacy during the competition itself, like you can just like time your advocacy better. Like you can do it at the end of the race. Like you finish and get off the race and you talk to like people or reporters in the post-match coverages. Or you can do things like bring a pride flag when you step onto the platform and step onto the podium and you hold up your trophy after the races have ended and say, I dedicate this win, or I dedicate my race and my success to the queer people around the world. Like even in the worst case, when you can't do things like, engage in advocacy throughout the tournament, at least you can do it at the end, which is still meaningfully important. And why then is this advocacy significantly more effective than doing a boycott? Firstly, you just get significantly more media attention. And this is because A, when you boycott something, like maybe get some reporters when you initially make this decision, but this dies down because a boycott is inherently the absence of action. You're doing nothing. This is something that is not sustainable for the media to cover time and time again because there's nothing new happening. You're just still boycotting them, right? But also B, it's when you boycott, even if you get media attention, this is only relevant to people that care about you specifically as an actor. But the comparative is when you compete in the World Cup and every single media reporter has their eyes on you. You have fans around the world that don't just care about you specifically, want to watch the races and the competition as a whole. You get significantly higher concentration of media attention when you actually participate and engage and stand in the stadium, stand on the stage compared to just engaging in a boycott. This is significantly better because you have to have more attention for the cause. But secondly, the type of advocacy is better in and of itself as well, because it's more inspiring. It's a positive form that is uplifting to people. When you can say things like this race is dedicated to the queer youth around the world, when you can, for example, maybe put a pride flag on your car and they can identify with that car and with that racer and see it as representing themselves and their cause. And this is important, right? Because it means young gay children can watch someone that loves them and defends them, race and fulfill their dreams. And this is unique to playing because it's not just about advocacy in and of itself. You want to watch someone that you think is cool do cool things. It's why people like care about sports teams that represent their countries, because you can see someone that represents your nation and your identity do incredible things. It makes you feel inspired and like uplifted, and you can feel a degree of escapism where they're doing something you always wanted to do or had dreamed about, like in your own head. And look, this is also more unique as well, because things like criticism is less exclusive. Everybody can do things like criticize a system or protest against a cause, but you're one of the few people uniquely that can provide escapism because of the fact that you can actually, race the car, stand in the stadium. And this is a car that, for example, wears the flag of someone that is really vulnerable, and they can see themselves be represented in the moment itself. If they wanted to just care about catharsis through boycotts or advocacy, they can just say other people just do protests on the streets. This is a unique way of getting an inspirational change that's often important to these people that feel disillusioned and feel hopeless in their own lives. This is a unique form of catharsis that we can provide. For all these reasons, oppose.
I would like to thank the member of opposition for the fine speech. With that, I would like to invite the government whip for their speech here.
Right. POS in the chat. The causes of social movements often succeed not when states are strong and stable, but when there is uncertainty and states cannot afford to risk losing popular support. That is why Malaysia created great reforms under the current unity government, because they knew they had to do it to retain the semblance of legitimacy and consolidate power amidst our political instability. That is why the BLM violent protest led to the prosecution of Derek Chauvin, the stripping of qualified immunity from police officers, when no other demonstration from the Black Lives Matter movement had succeeded prior. That is also why the IOC was pressured to recognize trans women on the threat of boycotts, because these power structures are much more likely to respond to threats of violence, especially when they're in a situation where they know it's precarious. And that is why the CG's extension just wins the debate outright, because we show that this protest isn't just a moral statement for yourself or the F1 circuit. It has the potential to cascade down into so many other progressive changes in Qatar because of the unique economic and geopolitical landscape in the Middle East that we don't think gets sufficient response from the previous speaker. We point to three things. The first is the geopolitical uncertainty with the crisis in Gaza, the assassination of the Hamas leader in Tehran, which necessitates an Iranian response. In the past, Qatar has served as a mediator in the conflict between Hamas and Israel before, because Qatar is quite proximate in the Middle East or in the Gulf. And that's why any kind of geopolitical crisis that results in economic instability or the refugee crisis and investors and capital flight pulling out necessarily affects Qatar as well by virtue of proximity. Qatar has had to deal with this in the past, but the current geopolitical crisis and the escalation by Israel and the necessary coming Iranian response means that Qatar is going to be in a very, very economically precarious situation. The second thing we point out is that if it wasn't bad enough, there's an economic slowdown because the oil prices in the world is flagging. The returns on oil revenue have been declining over time. The oil supplies, oil reserves around the world are running out. And even Saudi Aramco is finding less and less returns from drilling for new sources of oil because it's just a fossil fuel and there's just not enough of it around the world. The third thing we point out is that you have a bad experience with the FIFA World Cup. And while Qatar didn't make concessions from the protest in the last World Cup, they also couldn't act to shut down protests internally and externally, which many feminist groups in Qatar hailed as a win and hailed as progress, because previously they were arrested and shut down by the state. What this shows is that the current situation in Qatar is unstable, is uncertain, and that's why it's very ripe for change. The Qatar government doesn't have the choice to prioritize religious and traditional values over the kind of things you're talking about, because the Grand Prix serves as such a huge source of economic revenue, and you as a seven-time racer has a unique ability to threaten that economic security. Why does this extension beat the OG very cleanly? The first is because we show this is very likely to be the tipping point for change because of the unique position that Qatar is in right now. And even if you don't buy that the tipping point happens, the geopolitical context shows that we're able to achieve significant amount of political gains that can be used for iterative changes in the future, which also again puts us ahead of OG and by extension opening up that relies on some very slow forms of change to happen. The outcome here is that Qatar is much more open to making change because the threat to the Grand Prix is a big threat to their economic security for the next 4 to 5 years. We show in terms of mechanism, one, we pressure Qatar and F1 to making concessions to not disqualify the gay driver, as I think OG demonstrates. But going beyond that, we show that we can platform existing internal protests, both internally and externally. Sometimes these protests need an international figure that the imams cannot arrest to just point out why things are so bad. Sometimes these things can trigger secondary protests, both internally and externally, the same way this entire Arab Spring happened, right? Because these problems were just really brewing for a long period of time. And once protests happened and what people pointed it out, this cascaded all the way down there. You can also lead other liberal companies like McLaren to shows of solidarity. So maybe they might not pull their drivers, but they'll make strong statements expressing their solidarity. And we think that's pretty important as well. All of these things show a greater manifestation of the principle, but also a stronger alignment with the actors' interests. That's why this extension just beats opening gulf cleanly. Let's deal with then with opposition. Off the top, I want to point out that in terms of weighing against the odd bench, even if the driver loses out and the actor loses out, that's okay, because both OO and to an extent CO don't really attempt to disprove the moral analysis that we hear from Gov. That is, someone holding a position of significant influence, having expressed clear support of LGBTQ rights, has an obligation to act in line with his beliefs and in line with his principles by virtue of the position that he holds and the reviews preferences that he's done before. So even if it comes at a cost towards himself, he still has an obligation to act or to try to act because it's in line with his principles. CG shows the likelihood of clear outcomes manifesting, which beats OO in the likelihood of change happening, but also I guess to some extent CO as well, because they're also like fighting for alternative forms of advocacy. So now let's deal with the odd bench as a whole. Let's first deal with closing opposition. The first claim they make is that there's no leverage because internal Qataris are religious and they don't want change. This is wrong. Women are treated horribly in Qatar right now. The FIFA World Cup showed this, where we heard from women's rights groups and the suspected kidnapping of one of the feminist leaders. Right? This shows that there is clear signs of support for women's rights and for queer rights in Qatar right now. But even if that's not the case, the local Qataris are not the biggest source of revenue for the Grand Prix. It is sponsorship from multi-billion-dollar companies that don't really care about these kinds of social issues either way. So when it comes down to it, Qatar is not going to prioritize the local Qataris over the threat of a boycott from this huge international pop star, because the local Qataris don't have the kind of power. They either want things to change or they don't have the kind of power that the opposition thinks. Regardless, the Qatari state is unstable, and all the reasons we point to still stand in terms of creating protests and cascading change. The second thing they say is that equipment matters more than the skill of driving, so you're more likely to be replaced. This doesn't matter because you've already won 7 of them. You have the power now. I also think it's very unlikely that they will replace you for speaking out, because this company is going to get immediate international condemnation and suicide for the brand. It's extremely unlikely for them to want to do something like this. Even if you get replaced, no thank you. Even if you get replaced, the point here is that you have made this statement and that creates the cascading change that we have pointed to. That's already in the interest of the actor. You've already won 7 of these Grand Prix. Your career is set for life already. The last thing we hear from CEO is that the alternative forms of advocacy, because things like media attention is better, I want to observe they don't actually prove the likelihood of success. If you look at the BLM, people have no reason to believe what you're saying when you're being nice. We have pointed out issues of police brutality for long periods of time. We have not seen meaningful change until the violent protest that stripped Derek Chauvin of qualified immunity. So it is unclear to me why this media attention is better and what kind of outcomes you can achieve compared to the CG. But even if you believe there's a stronger chance, if you believe there's a stronger chance that we prove, then it is much better for you to do it this way, and you can also make lots of media statements on the outside of the house. The last thing we hear from CEO is that you got more protests on the streets, which is like a direct outcome that you're more likely to get in the CG's world when you have an international figure platforming it that cascades down and triggers all of these outcomes happening on outside. I think if the CEO cares about advocacy and moving these things forward, it is much more likely to happen in the Gulf world. For similar reasons, we already proved that these outcomes are much more likely to manifest, which also beats out opening opposition on the basis of the actors' revealed preference and the outcome that they can achieve. We're very happy to propose.
I would like to thank the government for the fine speech. With that, inviting the final speaker for the round, opposition whip here.
Hello. POIs by like you can ideally just turn on your camera and wave at me. I'll probably take one from OG at some point in the speech. Three, 2, 1. First, let's take out CG. I think the first thing to say here is that Qatar is not socially or economically uncertain. I think this is a lie from CG. There are 4 reasons why this is the case. The first is that Qatar is an absolute monarchy. They have a quite stable political environment. They are a monarchy underneath the Al Thani family. They have an emir. They've had a secure government since like the last decade without really massive domestic opposition. It's pretty easy to do when you're a monarchy. Second, though, is that much of their wealth and their economic prosperity comes from natural gas reserves and a really high standards of living. And they have loads of efforts domestically to keep pushing this out. So people generally live well if you are domestically Qatari, and you also generally have low unemployment rates and high GDP per capita because you're quite small. The third reason is that you have an extensive social welfare program that exists. Qatar has free healthcare, they have free education, and generally all of these things mean that you have good social cohesion. They've also, in response to the World Cup, tried to create more labor reforms, but I don't think that really matters insofar as it's the case that domestic Qataris generally live very good lives. But the fourth thing to say here is that you have really good law enforcement because you are very small. They invest in security infrastructures that are really safe to live in. All of this stuff about how Qatar is in this precipice point of protesting, I think is just lies. The second response that I want to say here is this, is that 12 minutes about this sort of reality of Qatar that isn't real, I think is insufficient at proving their actual burden here. That's to say that one driver, even if he is some supposed goat, is probably unlikely to cause some sort of resurgent Arab Spring for queer rights in a region where the vast majority of the population and your leadership believe that being gay is a sin that's going to send you to literal eternal damnation. F1 is quite popular, right? But it's not even so popular that you're going to get the whole international community up in arms because Lewis Hamilton decided, I'm not racing at this particular race. And all of a sudden, this is going to cause a cascade effect of protests. I think there needs to be a lot more link work here to explain why not just there's social unrest, therefore people are poised to protest, but social unrest in a way that's geared to be conducive to queer rights that will now help people protest. I think CG is out. Next, OG. I want to be clear. There's probably some degree of justice that you feel as someone who has consistently had a platform that has been pushing for queer rights for a long period of time. This is probably true. But I think you only feel a massive amount of harm insofar as it's the case that this is actually a binary choice. I think it isn't. You have a lot of ability to push out advocacy, and this is intentionally the large premise of our CO case, in a way, advocacy in a way that it's likely to be more material than the comparative that you get on your side of the house. Why is this true? The first thing that Liz tells you is your visibility and influence. Yes, you people rally around the sport and rally around your engines and your the firms that end up building your cars and whatnot. But you're also a 7-time world driver champion chasing an 8th title. You probably are relatively popular. You probably attract substantial media coverage, and people listen to you and opt into you, like OG acknowledges, because you are a winner, because you have the skills to back it up. And they probably know about your advocacy. But I think this is the core reason why people are opted in, because of who you are and the achievements you have behind you, not because you're also a driver who seems to support queer rights. I think this is a little bit of a stretch to make. I don't think it's the reason why people primarily tune into sports nonetheless. And what this implies here is that you're able to now leverage your position as a winner who's probably in a good stance to win at this Grand Prix and dedicate these things to queer rights. So what this implies is that you're able to now you're able to magnify the extent of eyeballs that you have on you at any given moment and make it seem more effective on our side of the house. This is a comparative that OG can't do. But the second thing to say here is that I just want to flip a little one of the premises is, and I just want to say that generally speaking, I think athletes and public figures who use their platforms to advocate for social change are often more effective when they actively participate in their field. And the reason for it is because anyone who wants to discredit them or think that they're just hogwash or bringing politics into the sport are unable to do so when they're consistently achieving results. So by achieving results and continuing to do so, you're legitimizing your message substantially more on our side of the house. We think this is a comparative that you're necessarily losing out on. And yeah, maybe the POI that's going to come next is going to be like, but you can race it out of the races. You can do other sorts of things. But the difference is this. When you're a 7-time winning world champion, you're someone who's so substantially dominant that it's equivalent in debate to going in a tournament, and it's unexpected if you aren't top speaking or if you aren't breaking first or breaking second. We think at this point, when you lose out on these sorts of things, when you have someone who's consistently at every single tournament breaking first and continuing to advocate and dedicate these things, it's a really powerful message that makes it hard for you to lose out on your side of the house. Sure, OG.
You asked for legitimizing the driver. They're already legitimate career-wise because they've already won 7 games. What about their personal advocacy? They lose their legitimacy if they don't do it or boycott this race.
So, look, I don't know why they lose their legitimacy because they don't boycott the race. They can call out F1 for being shit on our side of the house. They can go to media interviews and be like, look, Qatar should not have banned this player, even if it might have been a criminal. They could denounce this in loads of different ways and express their disdain. They can also explicitly express their support amidst of ways, in ways that perhaps don't necessarily alienate the cause on your side of the house. I think there are loads of mechanisms to re-bolster the fact that you support queer rights without necessarily boycotting the race, it's not one-to-one, and you need to explain why this trade-off is so large in the personal level that they necessarily lose out on this. For that reason, I think OG is similarly beaten over by the material that Liz gives. But I want to unpack this in 3 more ways briefly, and then I'll talk about OO. The first is to say here is that race days also tend to be really visible events. That's to say that you have pre-race interviews, you have press conferences every day. Races take place over 3 days at the point at which you can interview with the media 9 times throughout the sort of race, and you lose out on these platforms on their side of the house, right? Like maybe the media will put you on the platform the second you boycott, right? So like comparatively in terms of your ability to actually talk about queer rights, the media will put you on one time because, you know, you've done this big boycott. But the difference here is that you have 9 different appearances that you necessarily lose out on. But the second thing here is that you just can't do on-track advocacy in ways that you necessarily can't. Things like putting your queer flags on your car library, all of these things are things that you lose out on. I think for those reasons, we're above OG. Finally, then, above OO. Look, I think OO presents a really reasonable case about why it's the case that you're likely to face large degrees of backlash or large degrees of perhaps alienation from the F1 organization. All of this is good and true. The difference here is this, is our case is a lot more direct in the sense of you're just losing the amount of capacity that you have to alienate other people from the F, or losing the capacity you have to necessarily promote your existing stance substantially more. That's to say that like you don't have to hold the burden of like people turning off of, which probably seems unlikely given that you've consistently advocated for this sort of thing throughout your career. It just looks like, look, you're no longer accessing press interviews, you're no longer engaging with the same sorts of things that you can, and you lose out on race day. For all those reasons, you get more eyeballs and a clearer pathway of change, or at least maintaining your position and why it's in your incentive on CO.
I would like to thank Opposition Whip for that fine speech. With that, we come to the end of this